Leaders of the BRICS group of nations have slammed what they describe as indiscriminate import tariffs as they meet in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The joint statement by the Bloc of emerging economies did not mention the U.S. or its leader Donald Trump by name, but it comes days before a tariff deadline set by the White House. The U.S. president hours later threatened an additional 10% levy on countries aligning with what he calls anti-American policies of BRICS. But he did not clarify which nations he was referring to. BRICS founding member China hitting back while restating its position of non-confrontation. Premier Li Qiang is representing the country instead of President Xi Jinping, who skipped the summit for the first time in its 12 years as leader.
那么至于关税，我们一贯反对搞关税战、贸易战，反对以关税作为胁迫、施压的工具。肆意的加征关税不符合任何一方的利益。
As countries scramble for a deal with Washington, Mr. Trump says tariffs will be effective from the 1st of August if no agreements are reached. U.S. Treasury Chief Scott Bessent says the full force of Liberation Day levies will be applied to those nations without a deal. But he denied that the 1st of August is the new deadline for negotiations. Some countries are also bracing for a letter from the White House on the new tariff rates in the coming hours. And for more, we're joined by Ishan Garg from New Delhi, together with CNA's Afifah Ariffin in Kuala Lumpur and Saifulbahri Ismail standing by in Jakarta. Now, thank you all for joining us tonight. India, Malaysia and Indonesia, all, of course, BRIC member nations, along with China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa and others. Ishan, let's go to you first. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has called for reforms in global institutions, saying they have failed to address concerns and interests of the global South. What is Mr. Modi suggesting that BRICS bloc do?
Well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's main thrust is the idea that BRICS needs to evolve and show the world that how multilateralism can actually work. He said that the BRICS group of countries have a unique perspective on things, and he said that this grouping can actually focus on 4 points which can illustrate to the world how a multipolar organization can work. The first thing he highlighted was that the BRICS nation, which together comprise of nearly 40% of the world's GDP, they can work on financing each other's development projects. He cited the example of BRICS's new development bank, which he said needs to focus a lot more on good credit score, and thereby it can be used in financing development projects across the global South. Next, he said that sharing educational resources and experiences from each other can be a good way to make sure that the developing world can start to work on new solutions. And finally, he made 2 points, both of which critical for the developing as well as the developed world. He said countries need to start sharing a lot more in terms of critical minerals and those resources, and that these resources should not be held by any one country. And finally, adding that the use of artificial intelligence needs to be equitable and responsible. So it's in these ways he's suggesting that BRICS nations can show the world how a multipolar organization can actually work.
Now, Afifah, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim is also there in Brazil, representing Malaysia and as ASEAN chair. Malaysia has been keen to become part of the bloc. What else has he been pushing for?
That's right. While Malaysia is not yet a full member of the bloc, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has made clear his intent for the country to play a much larger role. So he's calling for stronger intra-BRICS trade, greater market access, and of course reduced reliance on traditional Western systems. He's also added his voice to the bloc's push for de-dollarization, saying that ASEAN has already increased the use of local currencies in trade as a step towards what he says is a more stable financial system, one that's free from unilateral dominance. On the sidelines of the summit, Mr. Anwar also held key bilateral meetings with leaders of several BRICS founding members like India, South Africa, as well as meetings with the World Trade Organization's Director General and the BRICS-led New Development Bank, really signaling Malaysia's intent to shape a more balanced, multipolar global order. But we know these multilateral efforts now collide with rising geopolitical tensions. We were talking about Trump's possible additional tariffs earlier, and for Malaysia, which already faces, is already potentially facing a 24% tariffs on some exports. This could further impact critical sectors like semiconductors and E&Es, for example. Malaysia's Trade Ministry, which has been negotiating directly with the United States, has responded to Trump's statement by reaffirming Malaysia's independent foreign and economic policy, emphasizing that its engagement with multilateral platforms is really something that's guided by trade facilitation and sustainable development and not ideology. Malaysia also stressed that the US remains a key economic partner with strong straight ties and decades of multi-billion-dollar American investments in the country. Now, these developments, of course, setting the stage for the ASEAN foreign ministers meetings in Kuala Lumpur happening this week, with top diplomatic representatives from both the United States and China expected to attend.
Saiful, Indonesia, meanwhile, is now the first Southeast Asian nation to officially join BRICS. Now, with Mr. Trump's latest tariff threat, how is Indonesia going to position itself?
Well, Indonesia walks a fine line, balancing its new role as a BRICS member while working hard not to ruffle feathers in Washington. Jakarta sees its BRICS membership as a boost to global prestige, but at the same time, it's racing to protect crucial trade ties with the US. President Prabowo Subianto made that balancing act clear at the BRICS Summit in Brazil, calling on fellow leaders at the Global South to deepen cooperation, especially in trade and supply chains. Mr. Prabowo has proposed the South-South Economic Compact, with BRICS leading efforts to help developing countries access new trade opportunities. And Indonesia is hoping that its BRICS membership can help increase access to markets for Indonesian products. But even as Indonesia embraces its place in BRICS, it's still keeping one eye firmly on Washington. That's because the US is Indonesia's second largest export market after China. The clock is ticking toward a July 9th deadline that could see the US slap a 32% tariff on Indonesian export. That's a serious blow, and Jakarta is doing all it can to avoid it. Coordinating Economic Minister Erlangga Hartarto, Indonesia's chief negotiator in the talks, is set to fly to Washington on Monday. In a bid to soften the blow, Indonesia has offered to slash its own tariffs on key American goods and open up new opportunities for US investment, particularly in critical minerals. It's also looking to import more US products to help balance trade. As part of that charm offensive, a $34 billion trade deal involving major Indonesian companies like Garuda Indonesia and Indofood is expected to be signed with US partners. The new US tariffs could shave up to 0.5 percentage points of Indonesia's economic growth, a hit Jakarta is keen to avoid. Still, as a member of BRICS, Indonesia is also expected to sing in tune with its new club, reaffirming its commitment to multilateralism and economic cooperation among developing countries.
Now, Ishan, I want to go back to you. A US trade deal with India remains elusive despite all the hype. Talks reportedly stalled now. What's the progress there?
Well, India-US trade deal, there have been a lot of ups and downs because most recently we saw President Donald Trump saying that BRICS countries could face an additional 10% tariffs, and it remains unclear if Indian authorities have responded to those claims, and it remains also unclear if they plan to respond to it. But there are certain media reports which are claiming that Indian and US officials are in the final leg of negotiating a free trade deal agreement, or at least a limited one that could be announced as early as in the next few hours or potentially in the coming days, because Indian officials had been working towards this deadline of 9th of July when the US tariffs pause is set to expire. US, as you would remember, had imposed about 26% levies on India, and India had been hoping to secure a deal that would see these levies go away, as well as ones that have been imposed by the US on aluminium as well as on steel imports. Apart from that, there seems to be more discussions about whether American farm products can be allowed into India, because India is concerned that those products if they come into the country, they could threaten the most vulnerable workers here who work in the farming and the dairy sector. So there are a lot of moving parts here, but we are seeing progress being made. Earlier officials in India had said that India wants to do a deal. It is keen on doing a deal, but it is not. It's not going to sacrifice its vulnerable sector. So it remains to be seen how officials who have been negotiating for weeks now, how they strike the final contours of a deal. The interim deal is expected to be announced at some point in the next few days, but a final deal could take much longer.
Many thanks for that update. Ishan Garg reporting live from New Delhi, together with Saifulbahri, Ismail in Jakarta and Afifah Ariffin in Kuala Lumpur. And for more on U.S. President Donald Trump's response to the BRICS group's statement and on tariffs, Kate Fisher joins us live from Washington. Kate, thank you for joining us. Now, President Trump has warned of an additional 10% tariff on countries that align themselves with what he calls anti-American policies. How could this affect ongoing trade negotiations, specifically with members of the BRICS group?
Well, I think it's another example of just how aggressive Donald Trump is when it comes to trade policy. The BRICS nations condemning the US tariffs, and immediately Donald Trump retaliates with this threat of a further 10% on them. But as to how effective this is, well, at the beginning of this 90-day pause, we were told by Peter Navarro, the trade advisor to the president, that there would be 90 deals in 90 days. But essentially, there's only really been kind of 3 that have emerged in this period. One with the UK getting a baseline tariff of 10% secured. One with Vietnam, who now have a minimum of 20%, but that is still really kind of only a framework. There are still many details to be hashed out on that. And then with the Chinese, talks are ongoing. They've managed to reduce the 145% tariff rate down to 30%. But again, nothing has been inked down permanently. And I think that just shows how unorthodox all of this is. President Trump suggested that countries were dying to make deals with him, but so far, we haven't seen that play out.
Kate, Mr. Trump says countries will start receiving letters in the coming hours on their new tariff rates. What more do we know about the contents?
Well, we know that his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has suggested in the past that they could immediately put the high tariffs back on countries who haven't made a deal. Donald Trump, though, has suggested that in these letters there will be ranging from everything from that 10% baseline tariff all the way up to a 70% tariff, though not on major trading partners, according to his Treasury Secretary. His Treasury Secretary, also speaking at the weekend, suggested that these letters, he believed, would spark more countries to make deals faster with the United States, that their contents would kind of spur on those conversations. And he said he expected to hear of more deals being signed within the next couple of days. Donald Trump has said that these letters will mostly all have been delivered by the July the 9th deadline, saying that there will be either a deal or a letter by that date. But of course, he has once again pushed the deadline for this implementation of the tariffs to August the 1st. That's the 3rd time that he's pushed this deadline, suggesting that deal making is a little bit more tricky than he had hoped for.
Well, time of anticipation for all of us here. Thank you so much for that update. Kate Fisher reporting live from Washington.